Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Joanna Lalikas, Director of Learning and Engagement here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We're really excited to have you here with us today for this Lunchbox talk, where we'll be hearing from the author of this wonderful book, Garden's Guide for Botany. And I'll introduce him momentarily. I also want to introduce David Michaud in the back of the room, behind the Zoom, taking care of our Zoom audience. He is there to support any technical issues out there for you, and also to support you in Q&A. So Scott Zona, our author and speaker today, he holds a bachelor's in horticulture and a master's in botany from the University of Florida. His doctorate is in botany from Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden and Claremont Graduate University, California. He's explored for plants in so many places: Florida, California, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, Indonesia, and so many more places. And his interests are in diversity and natural history of tropical plants, especially palms, salvias, and bradphytes. And he's published over 160 articles on these topics. He's a co-editor of the International Palm Society's quarterly journal, Palms, and he also teaches for the garden of botany and co-teaches botany for the artist with Gigi in the room, and other classes with the garden certificate programs. And he gardens now in Hillsborough, North Carolina. So we're really happy to have Scott here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna. So thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about plants. And what I have for you today is from my book, A Gardener's Guide to Botany, which just came out last month. It's not a book about how to grow plants. It's a book about how plants grow. And whether we're talking about plants growing in the wild or plants growing in a garden setting, it's pretty much, the fundamentals are pretty much the same. So what I've done is taken aspects of the book and sort of distilled it down so that I could talk today about the five functions that are necessary for life. And this really applies to all life: animal life, people, animals, as well as plants. And the first of these five functions is growth. So whether we're talking about growth at the cellular level or growth at the whole organism level, growth is an important part of all, important function in all life. We can talk about nutrient acquisition because all organisms have to have nutrients. We'll talk about defense. We'll talk about reproduction, which is the only way that organisms can pass their genes from one generation to the next. And we'll talk about dispersal, which is how that next generation then goes out into the world. So let's start, and I'm going to go through these five, and we'll start with growth. And you all know how animals grow. I mean, you start with a puppy with 4 legs, 1 tail, and 2 ears, and it grows up to an adult dog, stops growing, but still has 4 legs, a tail, and 2 ears. Doesn't acquire anything, it doesn't lose anything along the way. Plants are completely different. Plants grow in a modular way. Plants have modular construction. The above ground parts, you can almost think of them as sort of Lego plants. Let me show you how this works. The fundamental unit, the building block unit of plants is called the phytomer. And the phytomer is comprised of the node, the inner node, the leaf, and the axillary bud. And by taking those, multiplying them, and combining them, we get the shoots of above ground parts of plants. And by making modifications of the phytomer, increasing the number of leaves per node, varying the size of the node, growing out the axillary buds, all of those things, we can get really all the morphologies that we see in plants. So we can have in the upper right, we can lose the leaves entirely and have big, thick, succulent stems that are photosynthetic, like a pencil cactus or some of the other succulent euphorbias. In the lower right, we can shrink those inner nodes down to nothing and have a rosette plant like an African violet or a dandelion. We can have in the upper left plants where the stems grow along the side, like a ginger, or in the lower left, non-self-supporting plants like vines and lianas. So I've stressed that this is the way it is with the above ground parts of plants. The below ground parts of plants are completely different. The below ground, the root system, doesn't have modular construction. It grows and branches as needed, sort of a freestyle. And it's completely different from the upper part or the above ground parts of the plant. So that's growth. And so again, fundamentally different than the way animals grow. And by the way, also plants are essentially indeterminate, meaning they can keep growing. We and other animals grow up to their adult size and they stop growing. Not so with plants. They can essentially keep growing because of this modular construction. Now let's talk about nutrient acquisition. We have to eat to stay alive. Most animals have to eat. In that sense, we are heterotrophs. That's the term that we use to describe an organism that has to eat other things to stay alive. We are heterotrophs. Plants, on the other hand, are mostly autotrophs, meaning they can manufacture their own carbohydrates. We all need carbohydrates. It's an essential part of our diet. You know, for me, it's pizza and beer, my favorites. But plants have their own carbohydrates that they can manufacture themselves. And this, of course, is the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is probably the most important chemical reaction on the planet. It's the only thing that on a planetary scale can capture extraterrestrial energy and convert it to chemical energy that can be used on this planet. Yeah, there's a few little things that grow in, you know, hot vents in the bottom of the ocean that are not doing photosynthesis, but those are just footnotes. This is the main event when it comes to capturing energy. And the process is, I can describe it in a fairly simple terms. It's the materials used are carbon dioxide, CO2, light, sunlight, and water. And those are converted through the process of photosynthesis. It's actually a number of chemical steps. They are converted to oxygen, which is the waste product, and sugar. And sugar is the molecule then that can be used as the building block for starches. It can be used as the energy source to create proteins and fats and virtually all the other chemicals that the plant needs for life. So although it's simple to describe it that way, it is an extremely complicated process, and people spend their entire lives studying photosynthesis and just these many chemical steps that are part of the reaction. But this is the main event for photosynthetic plants, and one of the main ingredients is light. And for trees, light is rarely a problem. Most trees have adequate access to light, but of course, the plants that grow underneath the trees have to cope with low light, especially if we're talking about evergreen forests or tropical forests that have leaves year round. The understory is always going to be dark. In deciduous forest, temperate deciduous forest, there is a time of year when the understory gets a lot of light, but then it's usually in the middle of winter when it's hard for plants to grow. So given those constraints, there are plants that have adapted and have strategies for coping with low light. One strategy that we see in the woodland spring ephemerals is to do the most important part of the life cycle, which is flower and fruit, early in the spring before the trees leaf out, while there's still adequate light getting down to the floor. And we see that these are bluebells from England, but we see it here with our trout lilies, for example. Those are very early spring ephemerals. They grow and flower and fruit very early on. Another strategy is shown here in one of our native orchids. This is Tipularia discolor. And the leaves, as you know, are green on the top, but you flip them over and they're purple or reddish on the underside. That's what discolor means, having two different colors on the leaves. And it was actually only about maybe in the past 15 years or so that botanists have figured out why so many plants that live in shady areas do this. And we see this really commonly in the tropics, like in begonias and certain aroids. It's very common in shade-loving plants. And here's the thing. This is a diagram of a cross-section through a leaf. And up at the very top, we have the upper epidermis. Then we can see those upright rectangular cells making a layer that's called the palisade layer. And that's where most of the photosynthesis takes place. And then below that, the very sparse cells there make up the spongy mesophyll. And that's where most of the gas exchange is taking place. And then in red there is the lower epidermis, which is pigmented in these plants. Now, we all know that light is made up of all the different colors of the rainbow. White light comes in, and when white light is striking the leaf, the leaf is reflecting the green light, which is, of course, why we see plants as green. It's absorbing the other colors of the light, and the most important colors for photosynthesis are blue and red. And if you've ever seen some of the old grow lights, they're all kind of pinkish or purplish. It's because they're putting out lots of blue and red, because that's what photosynthesis needs or uses most efficiently. So what happens here is that, yes, that palisade layer is intercepting a lot of the light, but not all of it. Some of the photons are going to pass and not strike any of the chlorophyll. They're not going to do any photosynthesis. They're going to pass through the spongy mesophyll, and they're going to hit that red layer on the bottom of the lower epidermis. And that red layer, remember, it's red because it's reflecting red. It reflects the red light right back up to the palisade layer and gives the palisade layer a second chance at capturing some light. So we see this again, as I say, very common in plants that are adapted to deep shade. Now, our little tipularia orchid, right now it's leafed out and it's getting lots of light. But as I say, with the tropical plants that are in evergreen forests, the begonias and the calatheas, things like that, you see this very commonly in those kinds of plants. Of course, not every habitat suffers from low light. There are plenty of habitats where light is very intense. And just like with us, too much light can be a problem for plants. It can damage their cells, especially if we're talking about UV light, just like it damages our cells. And again, plants have evolved strategies for coping with high light. One of the ways they do it is with sun-blocking hairs. This is an Edelweiss from the Alps, high montane habitat where they get a lot of UV, and it's covered with these white hairs, which are reflecting away some of that white light. Some of it gets through, of course, and it has to for the plant to do its photosynthesis, but it's reflecting away a lot of the white light. Some plants have reflective waxes on their surface. So like these succulents from Mexico and California have this white waxy layer that reflects away some of the light intensity. And then, of course, there are two times in the life of a leaf when it is most vulnerable to too much light. That's when it's first emerging and when it's senescing and shutting down. So on the right, you see this plant. This is a tropical tree called Masua, and the new leaves are these bright pink. We see this again and again on plants. Mango trees turn completely red when they flush out. Even some of the ornamental plants that we grow here, like Photinia, will have bright red new growth. And that, we believe, is those pigments are basically functioning as sunblock for the leaf before it gets mature and kind of hardens off. And then again, at the end of the leaf life, what we see with the Japanese maple here, these pigments coming to the fore as the leaf is shutting down and protecting the delicate machinery of photosynthesis as the leaf shuts down. Now let's talk a little bit about water acquisition. I don't know if you want to call water a nutrient, but it seemed like a good place to put it here. And of course, most plants are taking up water through their root system. Roots are mostly there for water and mineral uptake and for anchorage or stability. However, some plants don't have a functioning root system and are able to take up water directly through their leaves. Virtually all the mosses and liverworts you see, and even some of the flowering plants like the little tillandsias, or if you're down in Savannah, the Spanish moss that's hanging from the oak trees there. That's a flowering plant. It's not really a moss. And like this tillandsia, these are plants that are absorbing water entirely through their leaves. They have a root system, but it functions really just to attach the plant to the tree where it's growing on. It's just a holdfast root. More research is showing that virtually all plants can absorb a little bit of water through their leaves. Not enough that they don't need roots, they still need roots, but the trees around us, the trees and shrubs, they all can absorb a little bit of water through the leaf. And that might explain really why our gardens look better after rain, even if they're well irrigated and not suffering from drought. They just look a little fresher and more lively after rain. It's because they are absorbing some water directly through their leaves. Now, of course, there are plenty of habitats where water is not always available, or at least not uniformly available throughout the growing season. So how do plants cope with situations when they don't have access to water? Well, one way of doing it is by storing the water. Storing the water in their leaves or their stems or the roots, storing water for I was going to say rainy day, but that's not quite right, a rainless day. And taking advantage of the rain when it's there and storing it in their fleshy leaves or stems or roots. There's a whole group of tropical epiphytes in the bromeliad family, the pineapple family, that stores water outside the plant body. These are epiphytes. They grow up in the trees like the Spanish moss or like orchids. And they have these tight rosettes of leaves that form a little tank, and they hold water in that tank, and they absorb water from that tank as they need it. Again, they have a root system that functions really only as a holdfast to hold the plant up there on the tree. We can think of some plants as time travelers, appearing only during the wet season and disappearing during the dry season. The example I have there is a Mariposa lily from the Western United States. And of course, they're not really disappearing, they're just going below ground. They're surviving as either corms or tubers or bulbs, or just surviving as seeds, and then growing and doing the reproduction during a brief rainy season, like they have in the high desert in California, where this plant grows. Now let's talk about some plants that are taking some steps towards heterotrophy. So remember, we animals are heterotrophs. We have to eat to survive. Most plants are autotrophs. They get all their food from photosynthesis, but there are a few plants that are taking some strides towards heterotrophy. And of course, I'm thinking now about the carnivorous plants. And now this is a tropical Nepenthes, a tropical pitcher plant from Asia, but we have our own carnivorous plants here in the Carolinas. So, Venus flytrap, sundews, and of course, pitcher plants. But all of these now they're all green, they're all photosynthetic, they're making their own food, but they're getting some of their nutrition by capturing insects. So they are partially heterotrophic. There are other plants that are heterotrophic, but not carnivorous. And the example I have for you is Asplenium nidus. This is the bird's nest fern, a common epiphytic fern in Southeast Asia. And again, it grows up in the trees. It's an epiphyte. This is one example of several hundred litter trapping plants that we know exist. And they trap the litter, in the leaf litter, the falling leaf litter, in the crown of their plant there. They form these nice funnels of these stiff, undivided leaves, and that they trap everything that falls from the canopy, and they end up with this nice little compost pile in the center of the plant. And as that compost decays and releases its nutrients, the plant is right there to take them up, either directly through their leaves, or as the nutrients leach through down to the root zone of the fern, it'll take it up that way. Now, most of these plants can grow fine if you want to grow them outside their natural habitat. Asplenium is actually a common house plant, and depending on your level of housekeeping, it's probably not catching litter. It's just getting its nutrients the typical way, the normal way, through the soil, through whatever fertilizer you might apply to the potting soil. So these plants are able to survive without trapping litter, but in their natural habitat, they are litter trappers. I showed you one of the tropical pitcher plants earlier, one of the Nepenthes. This is another species of Nepenthes, but this is a vegetarian carnivorous plant. This is Nepenthes ampullaria. It grows on the forest floor. It has these open pitchers. The lid, they do have a lid, but it's small and reflects back. You can see it there in the lower right. It reflects back, so it doesn't cover the mouth of the pitcher. And scientists have looked at this and found that it's getting most of its nutrients through trapped litter, not through trapped animals or insects, just through the litter that it traps. And this is such a good litter trapper that the Sarawak Botanical Garden in Borneo uses this motif for their trash cans, which I thought was just great. All right, if we really want to talk about plants that have moved into heterotrophy, we have to talk about the mycoheterotrophs and the parasites. And I'll start with the mycoheterotrophs. Myco means fungus, and heterotroph, as I said, is an organism that has to eat to stay alive. The plant shown here, this is a little gentian relative from this. I took this in rainforest in the island of Dominica. That was in the middle of the day, but it looks like it's in the middle of the night because it's really dark. So these plants, because they're not relying on photosynthesis, they can live in the forest floor where it's very dark, where most plants could not survive. Because these plants, these mycoheterotrophs, are getting nutrition through a partnership with fungi. And a good example of that is our native Monotropa. This is in the rhododendron family. And this plant could not photosynthesize to save its soul. I mean, it just does not have a drop of chlorophyll in it. It must get all its nutrition from a partnership with fungi. And maybe partnership is not the right word here, because it's actually getting its carbohydrates from the trees that have a partnership with mycorrhizal fungi. Now, you've probably all heard of mycorrhizae. These are the fungi that colonize the roots of trees and shrubs, and they get carbohydrates from the plant, and they give the plant water and minerals, especially phosphorus. So where does Monotropa and other mycoheterotrophs fit in? Well, it's not sure if they're part of some sort of nutritional menage a trois, or are they interlopers, just sort of parasitizing the partnership between the mycorrhizae and the tree. And we really don't know for sure. I think they're probably parasites. I don't think they're giving anything back to either the fungus or to the tree. And this way of life has evolved again and again in lots of different families. I showed you the gentian. This is in the rhododendron family. Here on the left is an orchid, and there on the right is a little Thismia from Malaysia in the Burmaniaceae. All of these are non-photosynthetic, and they rely completely on probably parasitizing mycorrhizae fungi. Oops, hang on, my microphone fell off. I'll tell you what, I can hold it, makes it easier. Now let's talk about parasites. And you all know mistletoe. It grows around here. You've all seen it, I'm sure. And you know that mistletoe is a parasitic plant. Well, we actually call it a hemiparasite. Hemi, the prefix there means half or partial. In this case, it's partially parasitic. It's a perfectly green and happy photosynthetic plant. It's manufacturing all its carbohydrates, just like all the ordinary trees and shrubs do, but it's getting its minerals and its water parasitically from its host. It's stealing that from its host. And as far as we know, it's not giving anything back. So it's not a mutually beneficial arrangement. So these are hemiparasites. Mistletoes are great examples of hemiparasites, and there are lots of different kinds of mistletoes all over the world. And the other kind of parasite then are the holoparasites. And holo means complete or total. So these are the total parasites. No roots, no leaves, or at least no functional leaves, and no photosynthesis. In fact, many of these holoparasites live completely inside their host, and you never even know they're there until they flower. And the best example I have for you of that is Rafflesia. It's a genus of parasitic plants from Southeast Asia. And when I think of Rafflesia, I am reminded of one of my favorite science fiction films, Aliens. And when these bloom, they remind me of a scene from this movie. If you don't like movie gore, close your eyes. You probably know the scene I'm going to show you. This is the scene. And you can open your eyes. This is a bud emerging from the host, and which is a vine in the grape family there in Southeast Asia. And these buds emerge. The plant seems no worse for having this parasitic plant living inside of it. And this bud will open up to be a Rafflesia flower. Now, there are about 60 species of Rafflesia, including Rafflesia arnoldii, which is the biggest flower in the world. It's about 3 feet across. These are amazing plants and really just a perfect example of a holoparasitic plant. Okay, let's switch gears, and I'm going to take a second to get my microphone hooked on again. Okay, and talk about defense. And we all know how animals defend themselves, and we've seen lots of footage there on the National Geographic Channel of lions chasing zebras, the famous fight or flight response that animals have. Well, plants can't do that. They are literally rooted to one spot. But they have to defend themselves. And so they do so through layers of security. And there are 3 layers that I'll talk about: the perimeter defenses, the constitutive defenses, and the inducible defenses. And the perimeter defenses are just what it sounds like. It's like having a perimeter fence. So something like the thorns, which are the modified stems you see on this Gleditsia honey locust tree. They are spines, which are modified leaves or leaf parts like this holly. And they can be prickles, which are what you find on roses. These are epidermal outgrowths. And if you've tried to handle roses and pruned roses, they can do damage. They'll definitely make their presence known. But there are plenty of herbivores that can walk right past those prickles. And of course, I'm thinking about insects. Those prickles aren't going to do a bit of good for small little insects, which could just walk right around them. So the perimeter defenses has to be scaled down to the level where they can work against some of the insects. So this is a photo of the leaf of a Arabidopsis in the cabbage family. And the trichomes, or the hairs there on the surface of the leaf, are these 3-pronged, nasty, stiff, pointed things, which would do serious damage to a soft-bodied insect, like a caterpillar. But even this, which looks like a pretty impenetrable defense, even this would not stop something very small, like a mite, or even smaller, like a bacteria or a fungal spore, something really small. So for that, plants have that next layer of defense. These are the constitutive defenses. And there's lots and lots of them. This is just a sampling of them. And I'm not going to even talk about all of them because there's so much to talk about here. I'll just talk about a few. But these are defenses that are always present, always on, always working to defend the plant. And I'm going to start with fibers. Now, we think of fibers, when we think of fibers, we think of, you know, the usefulness that they have for us. We harvest flax, for example, to make linen. This is a banana from the Southeast Asia that produces fibers in its leaves that are harvested to make fabrics. Sisal from agaves, hemp. There's lots of different fiber plants that we exploit and use those fibers. What are those fibers doing for the plant? I mean, they're not there just for our benefit. They're actually there for a couple of things. Obviously they can provide some structural support, some rigidity to the plant, so the plant can stand upright and do what it needs to do. But they're also part of the defense system. Fibers are tough to chew. They're tough to bite out. They have no nutritional value. Animals have to chew and chew and chew to process them. And most herbivores, just like us, you know, given the choice between a chewy, stringy, fibrous plant and a nice, tender, succulent plant, we'd go for the tender plant because it's easier to chew and there's actually more nutrition per unit than there is in these fibrous plants. And the other thing is, if an herbivore is there eating the fibers or eating a fibrous plant, it has to take a lot of time to do so. It has to take a lot of time to bite and to chew and process. And while it's doing that, it's vulnerable to its predators, and animals don't want to be vulnerable to predators. So this is the fibers in plants are an excellent constitutive defense. They're always there, they're always working. Another good example would be resin. You all, you know, poke a pine and the resin oozes out. Resin is found in ducks. It actually can be somewhat under pressure so that it will ooze out when the plant is wounded. It is both a physical and a chemical defense. It's physical in that it can gum up the mouth parts of insects. It can harden and seal the wound and make like a Band-Aid over the wound to prevent pathogens from entering. And it can contain chemicals which are either repellent or outright toxic to animals. So it is both a chemical and a physical defense. Latex is another good example. Latex is completely different from resin, but if you've ever dealt with like a fig tree, you know, it produces all that white latex, which is, again, a defense. Now, my favorite defense is cyanide. And cyanide is the universal toxin. It's toxic to virtually all aerobic life, animals, as well as plants. And of course, this begs the question then, how does a plant manufacture a chemical that is toxic to plants? Well, it does so by manufacturing the cyanide, HCN there, with a sugar molecule attached to it. And so the sugar cyanide duplex molecule is called the cyanogenic glycoside, and that is completely harmless. It can be stored in the plant, it can be moved around as needed, absolutely harmless. However, the plant may manufacture an enzyme, or the enzyme will be found in the digestive system of an animal, an enzyme that breaks that sugar cyanide bond. This is called the glucosidase enzyme, and this enzyme is stored in a different part of the plant or a different part of the cell of the plants. And so obviously when an animal is chewing and eating the leaves, it's bringing together that enzyme and the cyanogenic glycoside, and the enzyme is cleaving that cyanide. It's actually a couple of chemical steps, but it cleaves the cyanide off, releases the cyanide, and the herbivore gets a mouthful of cyanide. And that is definitely a very good deterrent. There are lots of cyanogenic plants that's found throughout the plant kingdom. There are cyanogenic ferns. Bracken fern is cyanogenic. There are cyanogenic conifers, and there are lots of cyanogenic flowering plants. I have just 4 examples to show you that are probably familiar to you. In the upper left is Nandina domestica. This is an Asian plant that is commonly grown here as an ornamental and has unfortunately become a bit invasive here in the Southeast. It's loaded with cyanide. The fruit also have cyanide when they're young. The cyanide diminishes over time, but they're full of cyanide. Passion vines, the leaves of Passiflora are full of cyanide. In the lower right is elderberry, Sambucus. Sambucus, again, full of cyanide. Again, the fruit also start out cyanogenic. They kind of lose a little bit of their cyanide as they age. And then in the lower left is white clover, Trifolium repens. This is an interesting plant because some populations of it lack the enzyme, the glucosidase enzyme, but they manufacture the cyanogenic glycoside. But as I said, that enzyme is often found in the digestive system of animals. So even though they lack the enzyme, they are still cyanogenic to most animals that would eat them. Now I want to move on to the inducible defenses, and these are just-in-time defenses. These are defenses that the plant does not have to manufacture, doesn't have to invest the energy into making them until they're absolutely needed and necessary. And the two that I want to talk about are jasminates and salicylates. And actually, those are the structures of the two there. And these are signaling molecules. These are released the minute an insect takes a bite of a leaf. And in fact, sometimes even before, there's research showing that an insect walking on a leaf can trigger these to be released. And when these signaling compounds are released, they signal throughout the plant to upregulate all the other defenses that the plant has. So if the plant has alkaloids or cyanogenic glycosides or any other chemical defenses, it tells the plant to make lots of it, to really turn it on, because there's obviously an herbivore in the neighborhood, and this plant wants to defend itself. But the interesting thing is that jasminates and salicylates both have a volatile component that volatilize, are released by the plant and are intercepted and recognized by plants growing around it. So those plants then say, there's an herbivore in the neighborhood, we better turn on our defensive systems and upregulate our defenses. So, and there's also research that shows that they are transmitted through mycorrhizae and shared through mycorrhizal networks. So these are really interesting molecules. There's lots of interest in research in using them in horticultural, agricultural settings where a plant could turn on its defenses only when needed, which obviously is a good thing for the plant. All right, we're going to switch gears now and talk about reproduction, which of course is sex, but fortunately you all are grown-ups here, so we can talk about this. For the same reason that plants have to defend themselves in place, plants have a problem when it comes to sex. And that is, again, they are rooted to one spot. They can't move around, they can't find a mate, they cannot reproduce the way animals can. So of course, they have to rely on some go-betweens. And this, of course, is what we talk about when we talk about pollination. Pollination is the movement of pollen from one plant from one flower to another, one cone to another on a different plant or even within the same plant. On the right there is pine, and you all know what it's like living here when the pines are producing pollen. They're producing vast quantities because these are wind pollinated plants. They're relying on wind to move the pollen from the male cones to the female cones. And with wind pollination, it's a numbers game. You just have to saturate the air with pollen, and some of it, a very small percentage of it, will land on its intended target, the female cone. And of course, lots of plants do this, and not just the pines, but the oaks and the sweet gums and lots of other plants are wind pollinated. Now, on the left is an example of an insect pollinated plant. These plants don't have to produce pollen in such vast quantities because they're relying on an animal, in this case a syrphid fly, from picking up the pollen and taking it very specifically from one flower to another. And so that's animal pollination. Of course, there's lots of different kinds of animals involved in pollination. Hummingbirds are probably my favorite. We see lots of interest now in pollinator gardens. On lost my microphone again, sorry. Pollinator gardens are big on, if you read the blogs or see lots of pollinator gardens in public spaces. And they tend to focus on butterflies and hummingbirds and even honeybees, even though they're not native to this area, but they're very much a part of our pollinator community here. But I'm here to tell you, on a global basis, those are not the most important pollinators. Even in our area, they're not the most important pollinators. The most important pollinators are moths. And yes, the big, sexy hawk moths are great, but they are just, again, a small percentage of the thousands of species of tiny little moths that usually are dull colored, not very interesting to look at, but they are the real heroes of pollination. They do more pollination than these other organisms. And the second most important are beetles. Now, beetles are more important in the tropics than they are in our area here in the Southeast, but we still have beetle pollinated plants here. And between the moths and the beetles, those two are the unsung heroes as far as pollinator gardens go. I don't see a lot of pollinator gardens talking about beetles and moths. They should, because these are the main events here. Now let's talk about dispersal. And dispersal, for me, dispersal is even more interesting than pollination. I love to figure out how plants move around. You know, they can't move, so they have to launch that generation, that next generation, and get them out there in the world. And it's super important. It's an important step in the life cycle for all those reasons that I list there on the screen and more. Dispersal is super important. Now, I want to just give you kind of a vocab. We have one word that we use for the unit of dispersal, and that's diaspore. And that can be a seed, it can be a fruit, it can be a spore in the case of ferns and mosses. In the case of the dandelion, it is a fruit with one seed inside of it, and that little parachute there on the dandelion, that's actually part of the flower. So it's what we call an accessory structure. So rather than try to figure out where we're talking about seeds or fruits plus accessory structures, we just call them all diaspores, and it's just kind of a simpler way of dealing with it. So let's talk about some of the ways plants disperse. And one of the most important, one of the most common is dispersal by wind. We see that a lot here in the Southeast, especially among the conifers and the pines and maples and the ash trees. And with wind dispersal, the most important thing is time aloft. The longer the diaspore stays in the air column, the better chance it has at being dispersed. And kind of a corollary of that is the higher the release, the longer it stays in the air column, and the better is the dispersal. Now, there are two ways that plants can maximize their time aloft. One is to have a structure that increases drag, and that's what we see on dandelions, fruits, that little parachute there, that's increasing the drag, preventing the fruit to fall quickly. It slows that descent. We see it on the fruits of maples, lots of other plants that have wings or parachutes or little tufts of hairs or some way of increasing drag and slowing the descent. Now, the other way that plants can do it is by having tiny, tiny, tiny seeds that are so small that the viscosity of the air becomes actually more important than anything else, than drag. And so these are things like orchid seeds, which are very, very tiny. Some of the rhododendrons or Ericaceae family. Of course, ferns and mosses, all of these things. Tiny, tiny diaspores that the merest little current of air will carry them long distances, and their descent is very slow just because of the viscosity of the air. So those are the two ways that plants maximize their dispersal by wind. We can talk about dispersal in animals. And of course, anytime you see a plant that makes fleshy berries or fruits like this that are colorful and have some sort of nutrition wrapped around the seed, you can bet that that's an animal dispersed plant. And the plant is giving the animal, like this bird, a little incentive to do the dispersal, gives it a little nutritional reward in the fruit, and the bird then, in exchange, swallows the seed and poops it out somewhere else or regurgitates it somewhere else. Now, there are some cheaters in the system. There are animals that will eat the fruit and seed and chew it all up, and the seed is killed. Pigs and their relatives, peccaries, things like that. They are seed predators. They eat the fruit and they just destroy the seeds. They're not very good dispersers at all. But then there are also some plants that cheat, that offer something that looks like a nice juicy red berry, when in fact it's hard and indigestible, and the animal can't get anything digestible out of it and just poops it out whole, and it gets no reward. So cheaters on both sides in some instances. And then of course some animals don't rely on their vision so much as their sense of smell. And so fruits don't have to be brightly colored. They can be dull colored or even green, but be aromatic, and they will be found by their animal dispersers like bears or foxes, for example. And then we can talk about dispersal on the outside of animals. And this is adhesion of the diaspore by sticky fluids or gums or hooks or hairs, something that will adhere the diaspore to the animal just for a little ways at least, so that the animal moves it around. This is very common among small plants, basically weeds, plants in disturbed areas. There are a few trees that have sticky diaspores that are dispersed like this on the outside of an animal, but it's actually very uncommon in large plants. It's more common on little plants. Well, I think now I've been through all 5 functions. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but the 5 functions, and I showed you, I hope that plants are doing kind of the same things that we animals are doing. But what makes it so interesting in plants is not that they're doing it, that what we're doing, but they're doing it in such a different way. So their growth is completely different from animal growth. It's modular, like Legos. Most plants are autotrophs. They're photosynthetic. They manufacture their own food, with a few exceptions. Plants have a layered defense system of physical and chemical defenses. Plants have sex without touching, which is obviously very different than the way animals do it. And for their dispersal, they rely on other things like animals or wind or water to move their next generation out into the world. So I think I'll stop it there and take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Scott. Turn the lights on here.
Okay. Question back there. Wait, I think we need to wait for a microphone.
Yes, and I'm going to let David ask a question
Okay.
first.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott. We have a few great questions on Zoom, and if anyone on the virtual audience has any more questions, feel free to use the Q&A tool to submit those. But first, back to leaf color changes in the fall. Are there different submissive chlorophyll, such as yellow, red, or orange, that are visible once the green chlorophyll breaks down?
Can you get that last part again? There are different...
different submissive chlorophyll that are visible once the green chlorophyll breaks down.
And Scott, do you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm getting it all. Different, sounds like you're saying submissive, but that can't be what you're saying.
Yeah, submissive chlorophyll.
I don't know what that means, submissive chlorophyll.
I'm not too sure.
There are different pigments in the plant that are there even when the plant is green, when the leaves are green. A lot of those anthocyanins, which are reds, the flavonoids and other things which are yellow or orange, all of those are in the plant, and they are either upregulated toward the end of the life of the leaf, or they're just there and suddenly revealed as the chlorophyll is withdrawn. But I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, different plants have different chemicals. And so, yeah.
When you were talking about the litter eating plants, it reminded me of my husband who works on fruit flies. He doesn't eat litter, but the fruit flies are actually not eating the fruit. They're eating the fungi that are growing on the fruit. And so are the litter eaters, are they actually, are they using the decomposition products of the litter, or are they, again, sort of using the litter stuff as a farm for fungi, which are then?
Yeah, the latter. Yeah, they're relying on fungi and bacteria and microarthropods to break it all down. They're not secreting any enzymes. The plants themselves are not secreting any digestive enzymes. They're they're relying on the
support.
Yeah, they're just holding that their little personal compost pile, and then as that compost breaks down, as it would normally, they're taking up the nutrients.
Another one, Zoom. Could you comment on plants such as gay-wax that turn red in winter? I understand this is caused by anthocyanins, but how does this fit into what you explained?
That's a great question. And I don't know the exact answer, but I can certainly put forth a hypothesis, and that is, the intensity of the light can actually be stronger. I think isn't the Earth closer to the sun in the wintertime here in the northern hemisphere? So the intensity of light can be very strong in the winter. So having those protective chemicals might be an advantage to the plant. That's my guess, but I don't know the exact answer.
I have a question over here.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the cyanoglycosides in fruits. Is that in the fleshy part or in the seed?
It's not in the seed, it's actually in the fleshy part. So like if you're making elderberry wine, you need to boil the fruits to deactivate some of that toxin before you use it to drink.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's in the fruit.
And I think in apples, it's in the seed.
It's in the seed in apples, that's correct.
Yeah.
In apricots and peaches, it's in the seed, not in the fruit.
So how do you explain the selection for that with bird dispersal? And
I have a whole paper on that, talking about Nandina fruits and
right.
why they would want to poison the birds that might disperse them. There are a couple of options, a couple of possibilities, and I don't have a definitive answer. One might be that the birds that naturally disperse them in Asia, where they are native, might be able to detoxify or at least sequester away the toxin the way that cedar waxwings can take wild cherry, like some of the wild cherries here, which have cyanogenic glycosides in the fruits. And those cedar waxwings can eat the fruit without releasing the toxin, and they have cyanogenic poop, which is pretty amazing. So maybe the birds in Asia are doing that whatever is in Asia and I tried to figure out, and I couldn't find anything in the literature about what might be dispersing Nandina normally in Asia. The other option is that the cyanide decreases over time. It might be that as the cyanide levels decrease, then other animals are able to come in and disperse it. So it's sort of, it maybe allows the primary disperser, whatever that may be, first choice, and then any fruits that are left, they become less cyanogenic and able to be taken by other non-specialist frugivores. Another option, and I'll stop after 3 options. And oh gosh, no, I can't remember what the third option I was going to mention. Most animals, including us, including birds, have the ability to digest a little bit of cyanide. So most of the birds that would feed on these fruits would take 1 or 2 fruits and fly away, and that would not be a problem for them. They have the ability to detoxify that, just as we can eat a couple of Nandina berries and it's not going to kill us. The problem comes with here, when these Nandina are grown in the southeastern United States, the cedar waxwings come in and they gorge themselves in rapid fire on all the fruit that they can eat. And then because the cyanide releases slowly, they've got this, gut full of berries that's slowly then releasing the cyanide and will overpower their natural ability to detoxify cyanide. So there have been some instances of cedar waxwings being poisoned but it's kind of unique to them because of the way they eat. And unlike when they eat cherries, they can detoxify that cyanide. They can't detoxify the cyanide in Nandina.
Okay, we're close to the end of the session. We have time for just one more quick question. David has one here online.
It's very timely to this time of year. Back to parasites. Is mistletoe damaging to its host tree?
Probably not. In normal circumstances, you might get a few pieces of mistletoe growing on a large tree, and it doesn't seem to affect the tree. It could conceivably, if it was just completely overpowering a tree, then yeah, it could probably do some damage. But generally, no, it's not a problem, and you just leave it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
So much for being here. Greatly appreciate it.